This is Plant-Based Briefing, prioritizing plant-based protein in the scientific report of the 2025 to 2030 Dietary Guidelines for Americans Committee is a step forward, doctors say. From Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine at pcrm.org. And I'm Marian Erickson. This is the curated content plant-based podcast where I narrate a variety of articles on plant-based and vegan living with permission in about 10 minutes or less every weekday. And I'm pleased to have permission from Physicians Committee to share their content. And today's episode, I'm reading from a press release the Physicians Committee released on December 10th, 2024. So now let's get to today's plant-based briefing. Prioritizing plant-based protein in the scientific report of the 2025 to 2030 Dietary Guidelines for Americans Committee is a step forward, doctors say. From Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine at pcrm.org. For the first time, the advisory committee tasked with making scientific recommendations for revising the Dietary Guidelines for Americans recommended that the 2025 to 2030 Dietary Guidelines include more nutrient-dense plant-based meal and dietary recommendation options, prioritize plant-based protein over animal protein, and recognize the many benefits of beans, peas, and lentils as a protein source. The Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, or DGAC, continued to discourage consuming foods like red meat, eggs, and dairy that are high in saturated fat, while also suggesting that the next Dietary Guidelines for Americans specifically recommend plain drinking water as the primary beverage for people to consume. The Dietary Guidelines for Americans are used as the basis for nutritional guidelines for many federal nutrition programs. The Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, a public health advocacy nonprofit of 17,000 doctors, praises the recommendations as a significant step forward for nutrition policy. Encouraging Americans to avoid red and processed meats and to finally recognize beans, peas, and lentils as a preferred source of protein will help save hundreds of thousands of lives a year from colorectal cancer, heart disease, and other diet-related diseases that plague our country, says Dr. Anna Herby, nutrition education specialist with the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine. The DGAC recommends in its scientific report that the Department of Health and Human Services and the U.S. Department of Agriculture modify the order of the protein foods category in the Dietary Guidelines for Americans to emphasize plant-based sources ahead of meat, eggs, and dairy, and to move beans, peas, and lentils from the vegetable group to the protein group to satisfy its overall recommendations for more nutrient-dense plant-based meals. The DGAC reaffirms the current Dietary Guidelines for Americans recommendation to limit foods and beverages higher in saturated fat and to limit total saturated fat intake to less than 10% of calories per day. The DGAC also recommends switching to lower-fat plant-based foods, as well as nixing coconut and palm oils to meet this recommendation. By recommending more healthier plant-based proteins and other foods, if adopted into the next Dietary Guidelines for Americans, the recommendations in the DGAC's report would help mitigate the epidemics of obesity, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and certain types of cancer that are linked to the saturated fat and other harmful ingredients in meat and other animal products, Dr. Herby says. The DGAC, comprised of 20 nutrition and public health experts linked here, is responsible for creating the scientific report, which serves as the foundation for the 2025 to 2030 Dietary Guidelines for Americans. The scientific report includes conclusion statements based on a review of scientific literature, the results of food pattern modeling, as well as advice from nutrition experts to the USDA and HHS. The DGAC concluded its seventh and final public meeting October 21st and 22nd. The scientific report is currently posted on dietaryguidelines.gov, linked here. A public comment period will be open for 60 days. Just as significant is DGAC's recommendation that plain drinking water should be the primary beverage people consume. The current Dietary Guidelines for Americans overemphasize and unnecessarily promote dairy consumption. This is especially evident in the MyPlate diagram linked here, which includes a glass of milk icon on the side of the plate, promoting the specific consumption of dairy products. Milk's primary nutrients are sugar or lactose and fat, and dairy products are the leading source of saturated fat in the American diet. Nonetheless, the current Dietary Guidelines for Americans recommend 3 dairy servings per day for all Americans, regardless of calorie intake for adults, and specifically reject any non-dairy milk products other than soy milk. Dr. Herby adds, recommending water as the drink of choice is a win for everyone's health, especially for many people of color who suffer disproportionately from lactose intolerance. You just listened to Prioritizing Plant-Based Protein in the Scientific Report of the 2025 to 2030 Dietary Guidelines for Americans Committee is a step forward, doctors say, from Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine at pcrm.org. And I'm your host, Marian Erickson. And in the show notes, I'll link another article on this topic from Forks Over Knives. I won't narrate the whole article because it is very similar, but they do mention that not only do the dietary guidelines set budgeting priorities for the millions of dollars that the U.S. government invests in food programs, but they counsel individual Americans on how to eat. Everybody looks to those. They're taught in school based on those diagrams, the MyPlate program, etc. They're taught what to eat. And many nutrition and food advocacy organizations have been working for years and years to try and get scientific evidence put into these reports, where the big food, big dairy, big ag industries, even big pharma, have so much pull that it's not been successful. So this is really exciting news that science might actually win this time and affect these guidelines. And it's so exciting that the recommendations suggest beans, peas, and lentils be added to the protein group and list them along with soy products ahead of meat, including chicken, as well as eggs and seafood. And if you look at dietaryguidelines.gov for this current report, you can see the 5-step process that's in place for developing the dietary guidelines for Americans. Step 1 is identifying the proposed scientific questions that will be used by the committee and opening these questions up for public comment. That happened back in April and May of 2022. Then step 2 is appointing the advisory committee, and a call for nominations was held in June and July of 2022. Step 3 is where the advisory committee reviews the scientific evidence. And this is what has happened and just concluded with the scientific report that they published this fall. The committee met 7 times from early 2023 through late 2024, and all committee meetings were open to the public to attend virtually. And then step 4 is to develop the dietary guidelines, where Health and Human Services and the USDA use the previous guidelines as well as information from this recently released scientific report. And the new 2025 to 2030 dietary guidelines will be released in late 2025. So it will be interesting to see if these recommendations are actually incorporated. And then step 5 will be to implement the new dietary guidelines, working with federal, state, and local partners. So we can only hope that the new 2025 to 2030 dietary guidelines are actually written based on science and have humans' best interest and health in mind. So please share this episode with anyone who might benefit, and thanks for listening.